Good evening. On behalf of my colleagues and central office staff, I'd like to welcome you to the Shrewsbury School Committee meeting of March 13th, 2019. Our meeting tonight is being televised thanks to the work of Mr. John McDonald and the Shrewsbury Media Connection. This meeting will be rebroadcast on Channel 29 until our next regularly scheduled meeting on March 27th. It will also be available for viewing on SMC's website. The first item on our agenda is public participation. Public participation provides an opportunity for members of the community to address the school committee and is at the top of our agenda at each regular meeting. Tonight, no one has expressed interest in addressing the committee. Those wishing to do so in the future should contact the chairperson in advance of the meeting, and you will be recognized for up to 3 minutes. The next item on our agenda this evening is chairpersons and members' reports. Colleagues, anything to report? Mrs. Canzano.
Yes, I wanted to inform the committee and the community that I was very fortunate to attend the 8 White Poetry Observed opening night at the library. Maura Egan was the English teacher who put this together, and we were able to look at some paintings, see some letters they wrote to museums, and then see original poetry that they wrote and then performed. It was fantastic. There was a great turnout, and I hope this is something that continues like an annual tradition. So good job to 8 White.
Excellent. Members, anything further? Seeing none. Next item on our agenda is superintendent's report. Dr. Sawyer.
Thank you. I'd first like to congratulate the cast and crew and everyone associated with the high school musical, Seesaw the musical, which was performed this past weekend. It was an extraordinary show. The technical pieces, as well as all the acting and singing and choreography, was really outstanding. It was a very, very entertaining production. It taught some real life lessons about perseverance. Unfortunately, the Thursday night show went off as planned. On Friday night, they had a technical problem with the computer system for the lighting, which was really integral to the show, and they ended up having to, unfortunately, postpone the performance, and they worked essentially around the clock with people from around the country to resolve the technical issue, and Saturday evening's performance went off as planned, and then the Friday was rescheduled for Sunday, and I'm told that the vast majority of people who held Friday tickets actually were able to attend on Sunday, and we had some good lock-up business as well. So not quite as planned as far as that, but the students and the directors and the production staff handled it marvelously. So congratulations to them. In terms of a great announcement yesterday at Shrewsbury High School, Lieutenant Governor Polito was there, along with our delegation, Representative Kane, Senator Moore. Members of the school committee were there, including some remarks from Mr. Palich. They were there for Lieutenant Governor Polito to announce the receipt of a new grant opportunity. It's called a Project Lead the Way grant. We've had Project Lead the Way engineering coursework at the high school for probably 10 to 12 years or so. This grant for $50,000 will actually allow us to introduce, starting next year, a biomedical science class for our students, and then introduce over the next couple of years a couple of additional courses, including human body systems and medical interventions. This pathway is really designed to help students who are interested in potential biomedical type careers to have some experience with these, see if they're interested in that, and start hopefully building some connections with the biomedical community here in central Massachusetts. So that this seed money, which is through both the state, Project Lead the Way, as well as the Mass STEM Hub, which is supported by the 1-8 Foundation. So it's a really good example of a private-public partnership to provide some opportunities to build some new coursework and new opportunities with equipment. Jill Carter, who's an experienced science teacher at the high school, is going to teach the course next year. She also spoke, as well as one of our students, Nick Zecco, who some of you remember as a Project 351 ambassador a couple of years ago, who actually talked about his excitement of taking the course because he aspires to a job in the biomedical field, which is to be a funeral director. He was very well spoken about his interest and his excitement about the course being offered. So very appreciative of the opportunity from the Commonwealth and those organizations, and we'll let you know next year how that course is going in year one. And that is Superintendent's report this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. The next item on our agenda is a time-scheduled appointment, a fiscal year 2020 curriculum and technology budget report. The enclosed report in our meeting materials provides an overview of the proposed curriculum and technology budgets for FY 2020. We will hear a presentation tonight from Ms. Amy Clowder, who is our Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum Instruction and Assessment, as well as Mr. Brian LaRue, our Director of Information Technology, and Ms. Shauna Powers, our Director of Instructional Technology and Media Services. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to share some information about curriculum instruction and technology. I'm not really a big fan of being on camera, but the company couldn't be better. And together we hope to give you an overview about how we've spent funds this year and what our plans are going forward. So we'd like to give you an overview of teaching and learning, explain how the budgets support the work, and outline plans and priorities for the future. I think the first piece to think about is kind of the idea of building the budget really is about balance. I mean, there's the balance that Pat thinks of as, wanting to make sure that we're shepherding funds adequately. But the other piece that's important in attending to in terms of curriculum is these twin concepts of having a viable curriculum and also one that's guaranteed. So you're looking to have something that all students have an equal opportunity to experience learning, and there's adequate time for teachers to teach the content and understand how those two things relate. So our budget supports in a big way making sure that there's equity of opportunity for kids as they're learning. And similarly to the district budget overall, you can think about a part of our budget being status quo, kind of what we carry forward as predictable expenses for materials. But also, we have to support kind of innovation because things are changing all the time, particularly when it comes to technology, and we want to be able to leverage the tools we have to the best degree we can. This illustrates kind of the need also to think about the district goals and department and building-based needs, because although our programming is very consistent, there are specific pockets of needs in schools that vary. And so our budget often helps address some of those pockets of need. As you know, empowering learners is our catchphrase in Shrewsbury, and the language is purposeful by design. When we think about teaching and learning, we're always thinking about both students and also the staff. We want to structure professional development experiences that mirror what we have expectations for our student experiences. So I think the science presentation illustrated that really well. In order for teachers to be able to think about how to change their approach to teaching science from being a sage on the stage, I'm going to tell you, you're going to hear it, you're going to practice it, to being more open-ended and exploratory. Teachers themselves had to grapple with some of those concepts. They had to understand what it was like to push through some of those, I'm not really sure what happens to the leaves on the forest floor. I'm going to make a model, and then I'm going to learn some, and then I'm going to revise it. And in doing that, they can recognize in their students when students are uncomfortable not knowing and helping them support that. So when we're looking at rolling out new curriculum, we're not just looking at buying the materials or updating the textbook. We're also thinking about how our practices shift, and professional development is all about that. So some examples of PD this year include science content and practices, social emotional learning, co-teaching, and then strategic investments across departments. So within PE, for example, they're looking at the role of APE and how they adapt physical education to be more inclusive. So that would be something that would be really specific and important to that department that would also get supported through my work with the K-12 directors. Some of those investments are spoken to in the report, and so you can read more details about that. For example, with English learners, I think it gives you a good sense about some of those more niche reports. So I want to take one specific example and go a little bit deeper and talk a little bit about what that looks like. So as you know, across the elementary level, we've been invested heavily in inclusive practices, and that's one form of that is looking at the co-taught model. And so to prepare for that, from a curriculum and instruction standpoint, we have to think about PD for training. How are we going to support classroom teachers in understanding their role in that work? How are we going to support specialists who are used to pulling students out to support their learning and are now working in a classroom? How are we going to think about tools that help kids access the curriculum better? And as we're training teachers, we're helping students, then we're also identifying new needs. So, for example, one of the things that we notice in implementing this is that it's helpful for both the special educator and the classroom teacher to have a shared vision about what it means to start effective planning. And so they need to understand their roles in refining and differentiating instructional assignments for kids. As we invest in the initial consultant to do the training, then we also refine some of that training over time. And so it can look a little bit like a cycle. Another example of that is thinking about student success. So if we think about the kids that have been successful in the co-taught model, we've noticed their reading has accelerated. So it makes you wonder, why is their reading accelerating here? It identifies for us that in some ways, including kids in the general ed classroom gives them more opportunities to do things in terms of word work that they were missing when they got a double dose of another kind of reading before in a pull-out model. So how do we then take that thought for the kids that aren't in the co-taught model and think about how to improve literacy instruction? And all of that work falls under the umbrella of PD. It can also look much more linear. So if we think about looking through the pilot process, we often try to think about change by doing something small. We work out the kinks in a small model, and then we scale it up gradually. So the pilot project for science started with pilot teachers, developing units, refining them, feeling comfortable like, okay, we've got it, these things are working. Now we're going to build a supply list, support these lessons. We're going to impart these lessons. Next year, we're going to go broadly. And I think the state has changed standards for social science and history, and so we will be beginning a pilot process that looks a little bit like this, only we're in the very early planning stages right now. We can target specific grades because we know we need to look at civics education in grade 8, for example, so that becomes kind of a fulcrum for the change. But it will look like identifying some people to try the new curriculum, working through with a small group, identifying some big changes, and then get to a bigger rollout. So as we think about the drivers of the budget, one of the things that you see is that there's some small variations in years when we're implementing. Our materials costs might go up. In years where we're piloting, our consultant PD piece might go up. But for the most part, there's a lot of stability in the budget process. Last year I mentioned kind of reserving some funds to think about whether we lost grant funding, and so that's one piece that slightly varies from one year to another. But by and large, we have these different pots, 7 pots really going into the curriculum budget. One of them is to develop curriculum, and what that means is that we have people within each department who take some time over the summer to refine the curriculum work that we do to keep it current. For example, this summer in social studies, teachers at the high school, teachers at the middle level will be working with a consultant to kind of think about new materials to try out as a pilot phase. We have professional development, so under that category we'd have Donna Simone, who came to help us in consulting us and training for our co-teaching model. Text and instructional equipment, which are pretty self-explanatory. Educational supplies. I mean, I brought a prop with me today because I think it's important to remind everybody that even though we have a one-to-one rollout, we still use traditional materials to engage students. Travel professional development speaks to when we have people presenting at conferences. One of the things that's been really terrific is that we've been consistently represented at EdLeader 21, which is a national conference. You can see it's a really small slice of the pie overall, but when we get somebody who accepted to present at a national conference, we're not going to say no to that opportunity. Dues and memberships, so we get free books, for example, in professional reading that supplement our libraries by virtue of being part of ASCD. And conferences. As you know, specifically for social emotional learning, we've done a lot of learning in the field and participated in various networks to kind of get better at understanding what are the different components of SEL and how would we apply some of that learning in Shrewsbury. So if you look at the budget that's proposed for next year, you can see I'm still hedging my bets a little bit by leaving a portion in a mentoring stipends piece because we'll know over the summer what our grant allocations are. So I'm a little conservative there, knowing that we have to fund mentoring. But in general, the budget categories are pretty consistent. There aren't any huge variations in terms of how I would recommend allocating funds for next year. And I think it's really important to note that grants fund a range of activities in Shrewsbury. I think some of those are mandated things like the mentoring program for Title IIA, which is teacher quality. But some of those really have impacts for student experiences. So let me just go through a little bit of the federal grants that we receive and what they do for students and staff. So Title I is for student support. It's of regular education, and it's in Shrewsbury primarily focused on reading. In years when we've had a bigger allocation, we've also included math tutoring or support. But that changes depending on kind of the funding formula. So we get funded based on the percentage of students that are economically disadvantaged in the district. And we have a base level of funding. And if we get a higher percentage of students economically disadvantaged, we also get category funding from another source. And we have a big bump in that. We didn't reach that 5% last year, so you see we suffered a loss in Title I, which meant that we really limited the number of tutor hours that we had. In previous years, we had tried to be really efficient by scheduling tutors, that wouldn't work the Fridays before a break, for example. This year, they're not working on early release days, so that we're trying to protect prime time with students, and we weren't able to offer math programming, and we weren't able to offer programming in as many schools. Title IIA is the Teacher Quality Grant, which funds mentoring and professional development. That was down slightly, but it also was kind of offset by a new grant that came into play, Title IV, for student support and academic enrichment. So although we suffered a loss there, we got a gain in Title IV, so we were able to fund some of the things that we might not have been able to fund that way. Most grants are not generalizable in that way, but Title IV has got some really broad targets, so we were able, fortunately, to do that. Title III is for English language education, and so you can see there that funds some summer programming, and we just scale back the programming if we have to scale back the funding. But I think it's important to point out to the community how much we are supported by federal grants, because those fund some significant things that are help to sustain student achievement in Shrewsbury. And this just gives you a sense about Title IIA had a slightly bigger bump and then has come down this year. Title III has been relatively stable. You can see that increase that I talked about with Title IV and that really dramatic fluctuations with Title I. And we talked a little bit about the relationship between the three departments here, but I think it's important to think that although we've got the content areas of math and reading and writing and science, we think about technology as going across the board. And so I'm going to turn it over to Shauna to talk a little bit about what that looks like.
So as you may know, we're currently in the first year of our implementation of a 1-to-2 iPad program in grade 3. So in all third grade classrooms across the district, there's one iPad for every 2 students. Just like with the 4th grade, teachers are utilizing iPads across the subject areas to enhance teaching and learning. So sometimes students are working in pairs, as you see here. Other times teachers will use iPads set up in stations so that students can rotate through and things along those lines. Right here you see some students at Patton in Mrs. Darling's class, and they had studied Chris Van Allsburg, and so they were challenged to create their own Chris Van Allsburg style picture book. So they used Book Creator to do that, and just like we always see, they always have questions and ideas that we don't necessarily think of. So it was really fun. I got to go into that classroom and help get them started, and then when I would come back, they'd have a series of questions, so it was really exciting. Other classrooms across the district are also using Book Creator. This was just a great example of one that I got to see myself. In a 3rd grade classroom at Floral, Mrs. Stanwick's class, students were using Book Creator to synthesize Pilgrim research and to create informative text to share with others. So it's all, all different. Some of it is more creative, and other is more informative. So as you know, technology allows students to collaborate with each other and with their teacher. So this is the first year that our third graders have had Google accounts. So they have been introduced to using Google Docs, and you'd be really impressed with how quickly they're able to get used to the login process, which can be a little challenging for them to type in at students.shrewsbury.k12.na.us. But luckily, the iPads can remember that for them, and they don't have to type that in every time. So the expansion of the iPad program to grade 3 means that students are becoming familiar with these tools even sooner. And this is important because MCAS will be online for them this year, and so this will help them to be more comfortable with that. So consistent access to iPads in their classrooms enables teachers not only to plan projects like book creator projects that are expansive and time consuming, but also to just on the fly come up with cool new ways to try things out with kids that just get everybody excited. So here what you see is some third graders from Mrs. Richardson's class at Coolidge, and they had been exploring fables. So what Mrs. Richardson did was she created a note just in the Notes app that's built into the iPad, and then she was able to use Apple Classroom to airdrop that note to all of her students' iPads. And then, so when that happens, they each get their own copy. And so then they worked in pairs to write about the lesson of a fable that they had read and identify strong text evidence to support their thinking.
I have to also give some kudos to Shauna here because she had modeled that use of the notes in the morning, and by the afternoon, this is happening in the classroom.
It was really exciting. I went to the grade level meeting for Coolidge. It was at 8:30 in the morning, probably ended at 9:15, 9:20. 10 o'clock, this teacher emailed me these pictures. It's like, whoa, that's pretty awesome, right? So teachers are really embracing it and really taking ownership of it and sharing their enthusiasm with their kids, which is so important. Teachers are also using iPads in math. Many teachers like using the app Nearpod. It enables them to introduce a problem, ask the students to collaborate with a partner to solve the problem, and then they can take a picture of their solution and share it. So they can project that all up on the whiteboard so all the kids can take a look at each other's work and converse about it.
One of the things that is interesting is when you ask, what students are learning about, you hear about new apps all the time. And so the bottom one is a picture that we got around Math Playground, which is an app I'm not familiar with yet, but I think that's the pace of change. And so thinking a little bit about how we can have quick sessions at grade level meetings or leverage strength within the district to foster more understanding and to kind of think about spreading out both expertise in terms of how to use the technology, but also what new tools are out there is really important.
Yeah, teachers will offer, I'm trying to think, I was at an Apple workshop on Monday with some elementary teachers, and one teacher had really embraced Book Creator, and another teacher hadn't tried it yet, and the one who had embraced it was like, oh, well, what we can do is we can send some of my kids into your class so that my kids can teach you and your kids how to use it, which is amazing. Yeah. And there's no, what a great experience for a third grader to be the teacher. So it's exciting. So as Amy had mentioned, professional development is a really critical component of the process. On the left-hand side, you see some patent teachers, third grade teachers at a grade level meeting. At that particular meeting, we were working on the Google Drive integration feature with Schoology. So Schoology has this really cool tool that you can use that enables you to use all of the features of Google Classroom without having to use Google Classroom. You can do it right within your Schoology, which is really great because it's much easier to stay in one place. And one particular teacher at Patton had really embraced this whole idea and gone really far with it. And so she was, while I was sharing sort of the how-tos with the teachers. She was sharing her experiences, which is always really helpful when you have a colleague who, you know, can be by your side as you're going through it, and who has, you know, experienced it with her students as well. Do you want to say something?
For those of you who don't know, explain what Google Classroom
Oh,
allows a
okay,
teacher
sorry.
to do.
Sorry.
It's okay.
So Google Classroom enables a teacher to very easily send out assignments through Google Classroom. That it's like you have a Google Doc and it makes a copy of the Google Doc for every kid without you having to make a copy. It just does it automatically. And then the teacher can view the student work throughout the whole process. And when the student is ready, the student can submit the work, at which point they lose editing access unless the teacher gives it back. So you can do all of that right within the Schoology app, which is really nice. Oh, I'm sorry. So the other picture shows a meeting of the elementary media paraprofessionals. So they have a monthly department meeting that they use for professional development. Pam Santilli is our elementary media specialist, so she is the one who runs the meetings and provides professional development. One thing that has been happening over the past few years in elementary media is that we've really been embracing the use of technology. And one way in which they've been doing that is celebrating the Hour of Code, which happens in the month of December. Really the goal of the Hour of Code is to expose kids to coding. And so over the past few years, the media paras have really taken it upon themselves to learn a lot about coding and explore new apps and tools. What you see in the picture on the left is some students using an app to code the Dash robot. And then what's really fun about that with the robots is they can see exactly what the impact of what they're doing is in a much more real life way than when it's just on the iPad. And here's, oh, sorry, I got a little off. Okay, yeah, okay. One other really exciting tool that teachers have been using is Seesaw. So Seesaw enables students to very easily upload their work to their portfolio on an iPad. And then once the teacher approves their work, families can see the work that the student has uploaded, and they can even comment on the work. So it's really exciting for kids to be able to, you know, share the work that they've created in the classroom out with their parents in that way. They can also use the portfolio piece to view their progress over time. And teachers report that families are very engaged in taking a look at Seesaw and viewing their children's work. The book creator project that I was telling you about with Mrs. Darling's class at Patton, so the students, they already knew how to use Seesaw, so it was very easy. We exported their book creator file as a video, and then they were able to upload it to Seesaw so their families could see it. The nice thing about exporting it as a video is that it's device agnostic. It doesn't matter what kind of device your parents open it up on, it's gonna be able to play. So that was a really nice connection there. So we have a lot of teachers across the district who are using Seesaw, as you can see by the infographic. At the current moment, teachers are using a free version of Seesaw, which works well, but one of the drawbacks of the free version of Seesaw is that at the end of the school year, the student can't take their portfolio with them to the next year. And then on the IT side, things are just simpler if the IT department sets things up for teachers rather than teachers having to set it up themselves. It's a great tool.
So one of the things I've been really thinking about in conjunction with Meg Belcito is how we track the progress of kids who are participating in the co-taught model and how we can do that in ways that don't feel onerous to teachers or specialists. And so thinking about accounts that carry forward with students is one of the things that's on my mind. Similarly, we've piloted some assessment tools. One of the pilots that we've been able to leverage really for free this year has been Lexia, which we started off exploring as a assessment tool that might replace the reading assessment that we currently use at the elementary level. It's ended up to be more of an intervention support. So sometimes some of the things that we try end up becoming helpful tools in a way that's different from what we planned. But I think going forward, certainly thinking about the notion of connected learning, connecting students to networks, connecting students to each other, connecting between home and school is going to be important. Continuing to support inclusive practices and PD related to that and social emotional learning. Sustaining the science integration and implementation, thinking about the social science change that needs to happen. I want to talk a little bit about expanding the use of the iPads. Because we've had the 2-to-1 program at the grades 3 and 4, you can see more PD happening for teachers at those levels. This year, we're able to look at, how many teachers in the K-2 span have their own iPads so that they can start doing some of that exploration. I'm pleased to say everybody will have one, and so then we can start thinking about what's the role of the iPad K-2. How do we balance kind of the very hands-on, concrete experiences we want students to have with some familiarity with the tools like Seesaw that are really engaging in terms of sharing student learning. Another aspect of that has to do with really thinking about the use of iPads in special populations. And so one of the things we found was happening just as a local innovation was that when we got a beginner student who spoke no English at all, the iPad often helped to support that student when the English language teacher wasn't available. So it became a way of kind of translating and finding meaningful work that would be at a student's level, even though the language was a barrier, and finding more consistent supports so that was an opportunity for kids across schools was important, because what we were finding was that teachers were robbing the other carts in order to make that useful for beginners, and then, as you know, a beginner is going to maybe need that crutch for a little bit longer than a student at another level. So thinking about how English learners leverage the iPads is a slightly different way of thinking about, in some ways they just look like they're typical learners, and in other ways there's some specific apps that are really helpful to them. And finally, as you know, the classroom projectors piece is another issue that's going to require some continual monitoring and investment. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to the guy who really knows about the investment in terms of our network and systems.
So just to kind of give you an overview of the IT budget, excuse me, the IT budget is, a lot of it you can think of as the stuff kind of behind the scenes that keeps things running. In a lot of areas, if we do our jobs right, people don't know we're there. It's when, so people realize that something's wrong, that, people realize we're there. So sometimes it's better if people don't know. But obviously, the IT budget provides hardware, iPads, laptops for staff, computers for labs and staff members, software, data processing, which includes PowerSchool, some of our other data systems like our teacher evaluation system, eSped, those kinds of things are handled in data processing. Internet access, obviously, which is provided by Selco, and they do a great job of giving us cost-effective and reliable internet access. Our servers, which again, behind the scenes, just in a lot of cases, just keeps our various internal systems running. Some of them are systems that staff members and students interact with directly, things like file servers and PowerSchool. Other things are things that are kind of behind the scenes, keeping the other servers running, and the other IT services running as well. Switches and access points for Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi obviously gets more attention sometimes. In each classroom at this point, we have a Wi-Fi access point, and that provides capacity for all the devices that we can have in a classroom, especially when you look at MCAS testing and that kind of thing as well, where you have, a whole school and a whole room on at one time doing the same thing. And those access points and computers connect to switches in the background, which kind of ties it all together, ties all the rooms together, and gets the data off to other internet, basically, or other servers. AV equipment, projectors, obviously, are a critical piece of what teachers do now, speakers as well, for playing multimedia in the classroom. And then repair and maintenance, when the things that we buy with the other budgets have problems, we repair them with the repair and maintenance budget. So those are kinds of the things that are involved in the IT budget. A change from previous years, one of the bigger items here we're looking at is a decrease. A reduction of about $223,000 because we are no longer paying for the initial high school rollout. Because the high school was done with grades 9 through 12, as well as grade 5 that year. It was a 4-year lease that was pretty sizable compared to normal years. That has come off the books as of, our last payment was in FY19. So that's no longer a requirement for the FY20 budget. One thing that we do have to look at is replacing network switches at Floral and Sherwood. Believe it or not, some of the switches at Sherwood are end of life in terms of manufacturer support. So things like security updates and that kind of thing are no longer provided. And at Floral Street as well, we have some switches that need to be replaced. So that's about $135,000 there. Power school registration and lottery management. Over the years, the district has kind of created its own processes for online registration for new families coming into the district. And also for preschool and kindergarten lottery. Again, some internal processes have been devised that really, even though they use technology in some ways, they were kind of labor intensive. So the Power School Registration and Lottery Management product allows families to continue to submit their registration information online, but also allows them to upload their documents like proof of residency and that kind of thing, which can actually prevent the need to actually come into central office and meet with the registrar to complete the registration process. For the preschool and kindergarten lottery piece, it really facilitates communication, especially at the preschool level, where once the lottery was run, families had to make a decision in terms of which sessions they were going to accept their seats in. And there was a lot of back and forth communication for Parker Road that is kind of streamlined by going with a solution like this. So that increases the data processing line by just under 20,000. But we've started to use it already, and it's been helpful in terms of easing some of the administrative load, particularly for the lottery piece. In addition to the status quo items that I mentioned in terms of keeping things running the way they've been running, there are some investments that we are recommending as part of the strategic priorities. One of them is the purchase of mounted classroom projectors, wall-mounted projectors and speakers at SHS. And we've mentioned this, I think, last year as well. Part of the reasoning for this is that over the years at SHS, various projectors have been purchased and speakers by departments, and there are varying ages and quality, and the idea is to try to bring them all up to the latest vintage and make them all reliable. But also, right now, there are projectors in a cart in the center of the classroom, and that takes up space in the room, particularly with some of the space concerns of the high school. That becomes more and more valuable space. And also, as teachers are moving between rooms, having a standardized setup for each room could be more useful.
Also with the projectors on the cart, sometimes they're in the way, and sometimes like the image is crooked, and like you can't quite get it to straighten out, right?
Yeah, depending on the room layout and what kind of cart there is and what.
Sometimes like the top of your screen is like on the ceiling where people can't quite see it.
Doesn't work very well.
So we're looking to try to rectify that. Another piece is an upgrade of the computer lab at SHS that's used for music and digital art. And the computers in that room are about a little over 6 years old. There's another lab in the building that's where the computers are over 8 years old. They're starting to show their age. So we think that it would be a wise investment to purchase new machines for this lab where the use is more demanding, and shift those machines that are currently in there to that other lab to upgrade it. So there are some challenges as we move forward. The diversity and criticality of technology, particularly as we look at MCAS testing, it really, and as we move MCAS testing into grade 10, where it's a graduation requirement, it becomes more of a critical piece, and so that becomes a challenge in terms of making sure that it's all working correctly.
Simultaneously, I have to say.
Yeah.
That really stops the clock for a lot of calendar weeks as we
Right.
do both the testing and then the actual implementation, and then we go to the next grade and the I think I mean, if I look at the testing calendar, your staff is really out straight doing that.
Right. Another piece is the complexity of data, and one thing we've looked at, and Amy has worked a lot on, is to try to determine what views of various pieces of data are helpful for staff members in terms of analyzing student performance and where supports can be added. And it's a pretty tricky task to try to pull together a lot of different opinions on what is useful. And
Brian's been really helpful, because I think what we're trying to do is, if you recall the tool that Patrick has showed us around looking at the town's finances and spending, trying to do something that really focuses on student achievement and progress monitoring for students, that in one place brings, SEL data and academic data together would be ideal. What would also be ideal from a system perspective is using some of the tools that we're already using. So Power School might have a data tool, and Brian's been really helpful in thinking about that, looking at products that are from vendors that we're already comfortable with. And mostly we found a lot of things that are kind of like, well, not quite it. But in terms of vetting that and thinking about, both from the user view and also from the management view, how you make those decisions is really important. And Brian's been a really helpful partner in weighing in on some of that. And then also surfacing new options to look at, because every day we get an email from another company saying, have you thought about, Schoology AMP? And thinking, it looks like an interesting tool, but it's not the tool we're looking for. So some of the other challenges I mentioned are kind of our limited ability to offset materials costs in terms of grant funding being unstable, and so thinking about how we will support students if we lose more Title I funding, or thinking about how we balance some of the cost of the mentoring program should we lose a little bit more in Title II-A. Balancing, PD delivery needs is something I really wrestle with, because, all of this programming can't go from me to students. It has to go through teachers, and teachers are human, and they can only manage so much change at once. And so pacing out the work is also really important to keeping the temperature low and making sure we're really thoughtful about, the environment for learning for our teachers. And learning doesn't happen overnight, and it really should be a rich and exciting experience, and I take that as seriously for teachers in terms of the PD experiences we structure as I do for students. And so I think it's a good opportunity to give a shout out to, all the teachers who are in the co-teaching cohorts who have taught us a lot about what's working and what's not. All the teachers who are science pilot teachers who are really advancing that work, and who were very active on the last early release day, modeling some of those lessons for their colleagues, so that people who haven't done any of the science teaching feel more comfortable getting a sense of what that's like before next year. Although we have a lot of challenges, we have really ambitious goals, but I don't think we'd want it any other way. We have high expectations for our students, and we have high expectations for our educators. So I think, we kind of end where we begin, of thinking about how these strategic goals connect, how we can think about consistent programming so that we move the district forward, and all three of us take that responsibility really seriously and build the budget to try to make that happen. Time for questions.
Excellent. Thank you for the presentation. Colleagues, questions and comments? Mrs. Fritz.
I sit here thinking back to when we were talking about the iPad project and where we were going to go, and look from like, oh no, this new tool, to where we are now. I think it's an amazing road that we've been on. I need to hire a third grader to come to my house, because the things that they can do, it's amazing. And they're not afraid. They're not going to be like, oh, I can't do it. They're just like, oh, this is great, I'm going to use it. So when I look at the lease, that going with this leasing instead of buying, and it was a great thing to do because we're seeing the end of that. And I think financially, it was a smart way to go about it. When we talk about curriculum and tools, like it's so connected. We have great curriculum, but you need great tools to do all the things that Shauna talked about, like what these students are doing at such a young age. So I think it's been a great path, a lot of work, but I think it's a wonderful, and Brian, don't sell yourself short on IT behind the scenes, because we know if something goes wrong, that's when you need IT. So when everything's great, but it's when something goes wrong, we need IT, and I know that in my work life, it's awful, so don't sell yourself short on that. I do have one question on Title I. When we talk, it's so important for students, I think, that early, if you can't read, you can't do math, you can't do science, it's lots. So that Title IV grant that you're talking about, is that filling that need maybe for those
Not
students?
for Title I. Title I's really stringent in
Just
terms of
stringent?
what you can look, it can't supplant, it
Okay.
has to supplement. But Title IV could be academic support or enrichment. So there are places where we can think about intervention being something supported through Title IV. Last year, it was a smaller amount, and all of it went to social emotional learning conference expenses.
Okay.
This year, we had a little bit more to play with, so we've been thinking about supporting some of the work we're talking about with iPads or conferences. It can be a little bit more diverse if the pot is a little bit bigger. And it's interesting that since that's a relatively new grant, even from the first year to the second year, they changed kind of the description of what you can use it for.
Okay.
So it's interesting to see, how that will evolve over time, but it's mainly an academic enrichment and support grant.
Okay, so it's not that backfill, and to me, that's a concern with Title I, and I understand it's based on that socioeconomic model. Just hoping that there are other ways to supplement for those students who don't qualify. Well, the schools aren't qualifying, but we know they need these services.
Yeah, so that Lexia pilot that I mentioned earlier is what we've started out to find out, reading assessment tool. We found a really effective intervention tool, and I think we're not finished looking at it completely yet, but it's been really promising in terms of identifying where student strengths are as readers. They do a small battery on the iPad. It identifies, here's a student is really strong in academic language, but really low in word building, has good comprehension in general, but needs to practice this. It can push out practice activities through the iPad, but it also limits, like, this kid should only spend 15 minutes a day doing this. So it lends itself well to an elementary classroom in terms of a station approach or some practice learning. And then I think it also, one of the features that was really attractive to me is that it suggests resources that can be used, pen and paper resources and teaching lessons that are based on really sound research practice. So thinking about, how we get better at the intervention process and how we do support students who struggle more consistently is another aspect of the work that we've been doing. And I think that's driven some of my work with Brian around data tools. Because one of the things that's cumbersome, particularly as students transition from one level to another, is keeping track of the students that struggle.
Right.
So I think we've been interested in student progress monitoring because that's the right thing to do. We've been interested in it because we need to demonstrate, as we launch the co-top model at another level, how can we demonstrate the benefits for students in that model? And then we've been thinking about it as a way to really foster collaboration around intervention so that it's not just the Title I staff and tutors that are really good at this, right?
Right.
So we need to build capacity for that.
Excellent, thank you.
Mr. Wensky.
Yeah, a great report. Certainly, it does open your eyes to the complexity that's happening behind the scenes. I couldn't help but note that comment. I mean, the technology piece of it is really the backbone of success with all of the hardware and the networking and software that we have in the schools. You mentioned, speaking of hardware, you mentioned the mounted projectors, right? I think they were on the budget last year for the high school. And is that to replace, just to replace the ones that are on the card, or is that also replacing maybe legacy mounted projectors that have kind of are showing some wear and tear?
That particular item is to replace just the ones at the high school that are on the carts. We're looking at potentially, maybe possibly this year, replacing some other ones as well. There are some aging projectors elsewhere in the district as well. That particular item was mainly focused on the high school. There aren't too many. I think there are maybe a couple mounted projectors at the high school, but they're mostly on carts over there.
Gotcha. Do we know what the lifespan is of these mounted projectors, like 5, 10 years?
We've heard 5 years. That's probably a little bit short, but probably not too much longer than that. Part of the issue is as you start to take advantage of some of the features of the projector in terms of network connectivity, sometimes that can be the place where the vendor might drop support for the older operating systems, or I'm sorry, the newer operating systems. You might get pushed along there. Some of our older projectors at the elementary level that we've already started to replace, we ran into that with compatibility issues.
Right.
In addition to lifespan and just wear and tear, that is one of the drivers. So 5 years on the short end, maybe 5 to 7 on the longer end.
Sure. Okay, great, thank you.
Okay.
Mrs. Canzano.
I just wanted to thank you, Shauna, for giving us opportunities to see pictures and what's going on in the classrooms. It's really helpful from my position to see what kids are doing with these tools and like Book Creator. That sounds so exciting. So thank you for presenting it that way, because it gives me a deeper and richer understanding. Amy, in the report, you talked about textbooks, and over the years, the textbook has shrunk in the pie, and in here you talked about how since 2015, teachers, some, have been making their own. I was just wondering if you could talk what that is looking like now since 2015.
So I think if you look at a bunch of teachers gathering together to collaborate, they're all working on a shared Google Doc, and they're thinking about how to leverage, open source resources, and the media specialist at the high school is really outstanding in terms of helping to curate resources for teachers so that they can ask, I'm interested in finding this, and she'll put together some things to support that work. And I think sometimes it looks like accessing things that have been published through like Book Creator but are now iBooks. Sometimes it looks like open source material that you can get for free. And sometimes it's kind of putting together articles in a very informal way through Google. It doesn't have any one pattern. I think the thing that's interesting about where we're at right now is that we have to update AP textbooks, in order to maintain meet the guidelines for, advanced placement organization. We have to also think about, we don't all have digital textbooks. There are some textbooks that are really useful and will continue to be. So we still have a small line item for that. But you could speak probably better than I could to what the resources teachers are using at the high school level.
I think, yeah, you got it. It's a lot of different resources.
Yeah.
The good thing is that I think, Emily Bredberg, our media specialist at the high school, she collaborates with teachers and co-teaches a lot in terms of getting students started with their research projects. We do also have databases that
Yes,
students have access to.
increasingly digital subscriptions that have multimedia resources, so it's not, I still think in the traditional way of like with the textbook, and so the replacement of the textbook would be either articles or more current event pieces, but it's increasingly more multimedia than that. So there's a film clip, there's a novel, there's a chapter, there's an article, and all of those things get woven together. And it looks different in different departments, and in some departments it looks more traditional because that supports the content area. But I think we're at the beginning of having teachers be networked in ways that are much more sophisticated, and that has definitely been fueled by the connectivity that's resulted from the use of the iPads and the laptops.
That's exciting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. McGee.
I find this was a great presentation. I'm really excited to see everything that's happening. But I just want to get back a little bit to what Aaron was talking about. Can you quantify for me a little bit to what degree regular textbooks are being used now, and in what subjects they are primarily concentrated in?
Well, yes and no. I can tell you that in each department of the high school, there's a closet that has some basic textbooks that we need to update, and we look at the ages of those and update them. For example, that happens more often in English language arts, where students are reading novels and they get dog-eared, and we replace them, and we're going to continue to read novels. The title might change, but we know that reading is going to fuel an English class. And similarly, in social sciences, they're looking at a history text, but they're also looking at original source material and other things like that. In math, we have a lot of our curriculum in ALEX, which is kind of a self-paced online tool. And so in many ways, some of the practice that you might have had in a math textbook is replicated in this online platform to the degree that some students can kind of co-study. They're in this class and they're also getting caught up in areas where they were behind in even a different, what would have typically been a different class. And I think, you know, that in science, one of the requests I just got was from a science teacher that's really looking to look digitally at the human body by leveraging some apps around that. So I think in every department, there are innovators, and then as the innovators try things out with students that work, then it spreads. But in terms of giving you a number, I can, but not tonight. I'll have to research that a little bit more.
Good.
So, one other kind of just bit of minutia. You talk about an hour of coding. I don't know much about coding at all, needless to say, but it would seem to me that coding is extremely grammar application you're dealing with. Is that true? And if so, does this process of doing coding generalize in some way to other areas?
So, yes, I think it can be really specific to a kind of code. So one of the things that Sean has done, which I think is going to be a real help to the district, is work with an organization called TEALS, which brings in people from the computer science field who are very current to support teachers in computer science. Because there are so many different programs. I mean, there's Python and there's Java, and I mean, I'm speaking a language that Brian knows better than I do. And those change based on kind of the fast-paced climate. But I think when you're looking at the fundamental principles of coding, they're based in thinking, a way of thinking. And so helping students understand some of there are common principles across different programs, so that whatever students have that first initial experience with helps them kind of set the stage for the readiness of the other pieces, and helps them essentially learn how to learn coding, if that makes sense.
All right,
Would you add to that?
Yeah, that makes sense. There are, you know, some,
WPI graduate.
there are some computer science programs, you know, they'll use a particular programming language as a foundation, but then the other classes aren't necessarily about different specific languages. It's mainly about the concepts that you're using that language to apply. So and I think, I mean, obviously some of these tools are at a more basic level, but it is a certain way of thinking and a certain way of understanding how software operates that can be useful.
Thanks.
When we do Hour of Code, it's like drag and drop block coding where the kids are, you know, dragging the piece from the side over into the workspace and like clicking play to see what happens, and then, you know, adding on to that, and then trying to figure out how to do it more efficiently. So yeah, so Hour of Code is like a simple way to just kind of get the ball rolling with that.
But if you bring it back to my level, Dale, it looks like a kindergartner wearing a dog collar, and they have to get Spot from one spot to another by giving their partner directions. Spot, walk 3 steps forward. Spot, turn right. Spot, make 2 spaces over here. And they're negotiating to the dog bowl. And then they look at, okay, so if you've done this kind of live with somebody pretending to be Spot and somebody directing, then looking at the block coding, the first block is walk 3 faces, and then that translates into code on the screen. So for those of us that are a little bit more concrete when it comes to coding, it helps kids bridge that gap, and it helps them understand kind of the way a computer thinks.
Computational thinking.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Colleagues, anything further? I want to thank you for an excellent presentation, and in particular for demonstrating the impact that technology has on the classroom. I'm as I think some of my colleagues are absolutely bowled over by some of the things, not only that we've seen and heard tonight, but that we have over the years. You know, we are seeing elementary level students accessing technology and being able to perform tasks that many adults in a professional setting, even who use technology on a regular basis, are either just learning now or is completely alien to them. And of course, we have to prepare these kids to function in a world that's going to be 10, 20 years from now. So, you know, when we talk about technology and investments in technology, I think from the outside looking in, it's easy to confuse some of these investments with things, to focus on devices, to focus on brand names and such. And that's never been our focus. Our focus has always been the impact that these devices have on student learning and where technology can be used to accelerate and enhance learning. So I want to thank you for your work and for continuing to highlight that. Dr. Sawyer, anything to add?
I want to thank you for the report and the presentation. Several years ago now, we decided to combine the curriculum and the technology budget presentation because we wanted to really emphasize that synergy. That's something I'm glad that we're doing. I think you're seeing the benefits of that, and I think the commentary underscores that. This is an outstanding team. Amy and Shauna and Brian work closely together, and I think that I know that when districts doing this effectively, there is that kind of collaboration across the IT back end, the bringing technology into the classroom, and the folks who are leading the curriculum and instruction, along with all the other various curriculum leaders. And that's why I think we are seeing the emphasis on how to bring technology to bear for learning, as opposed to kind of a separate standalone add-on. It really is integral to what is happening in our classrooms, and that's really exciting, and we think it is paying off. And it is, when one does think about where we were not that long ago,
Right.
but longer than you might think, in terms of, we've been doing this work for a long time in terms of integrating technology into the classroom. It's easier to just forget that this is what we do. It's just kind of, it's been very normalized, and we need to, but at the same time, we are continuing to innovate. But excellent work, thank you very much, and we're very excited about what's going to be coming in the future.
Thank you. Colleagues, I'd like to take an item out of order on our agenda this evening, specifically our public hearing on the fiscal year 2020 budget. Our agenda for tonight approximated the start time for the public hearing at 7:45 p.m. We did advertise for 7:45. As it is now past 8 o'clock p.m., I do want to attempt to start that. So if there are no objections, I'm going to move to the time scheduled appointment of a fiscal year 2020 budget public hearing. At this time, the public is invited to provide input to the committee and the administration regarding their proposed FY20 budget. This public hearing meets the requirements of Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 71, Section 38N, which requires school districts to provide an opportunity for members of the public to be heard regarding the proposed school district budget. But of course, in addition to the legal requirement, we as a committee are always eager to hear the thoughts, questions, and concerns of the public. So at this time, I will open the hearing. If there are any members of the public, and we are a light crowd tonight, but if there are any members of the public who would like to address the committee and provide their thoughts on the proposed budget for next year, we welcome you to come forward at this time. And I'm making the two folks who are not part of the presentation tonight very uncomfortable. But anybody interested in coming forward tonight to testify on the budget? Going once, going twice. Seeing none, I'll close the hearing at this time. I don't recall if we need a vote to close the hearing, so I'm going to take one anyway. Motion to close the hearing.
So moved.
Is there a second? Second. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? The hearing's closed. I do want to remind anybody who is watching from home, we certainly always welcome your feedback on the budget via email. That's schoolcommittee@shrewsbury.k12.ma.us. There's also a link on the school department's website. So again, for any member of the public watching this meeting at any point going forward, we always welcome your feedback on next year's proposed budget. With that, we will back up in the agenda to another time scheduled appointment. This is the report on school department funding sources. In this report, Mr. Collins will present information on the variety of funding sources used to support educational, operational, and co-curricular programs in Shrewsbury Public Schools, and will describe trends of growth and decline in the major categories of funding as defined by the Mass Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Welcome, Mr. Collins.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction and description. And this is a report that the school committee had asked for a little while ago, and this, I think, is a good opportunity during our budget season to delve into a little bit more details with respect to the sources of funding that the school department uses, as you mentioned, for running our whole district. So the purpose tonight is just to provide a little bit more education to the community, some more details to the school committee. You have a very detailed report in your packet that I didn't try to replicate here because nobody would be able to see it. So I've got some summary slides for you about the variety of sources of funding that we use. And then, as you mentioned, Mr. Palish, to show some of the growth and decline in various categories. And these categories are ones that are used for reporting purposes by all Massachusetts school districts to the Department of Education. And so I sourced these right off of our so-called end-of-year report that we provide each year to the Mass Department of Education, and they derive and produce a lot of, and publish a lot of statistics. So that's the purpose. The overview would be in this chart here, which shows a variety of different sources of fundings. The biggest blue shaded area would be the town's so-called general fund or town appropriation. That's the budget that we bring to the annual town meeting and ask for them to appropriate those dollars to us for the upcoming fiscal year starting July 1. That is the mainstay of funding. And but also importantly, and I have a time span here of 2008, so it's a 10-year span, 2008, 2013, and 2018, to show various points in the trends. And so some of those areas, besides the general fund, would be the food service operation, which is that kind of skinny yellow area, which remains fairly constant over this 10-year time period. Grant funding for private grant funding. This would be the Shrewsbury Education Foundation grants. This would be private grants that individual parents make to the Colonial Fund or even their own child's school. And you can see that's the red area. It's very thin back in 2008, and it's grown in importance along this time span. And in 18, you can see it's pretty significant. And as the data will show you, that 2018 happened to be the year where we collected most of the funding for the synthetic turf project, and that was all privately funded. And so that's why you see that larger span there. The green on the top, actually, and I'm going to show a little bit more detail here. These are federal and state grants. So these are typically allocated to all Massachusetts public school districts based upon funding formulas like socioeconomics, student population spans, and total enrollment. And this is something that has actually shrunk over this 10-year period. Circuit breaker funding is in purple. That has grown over time. And so that's kind of the overview in terms of the major categories and how they've trended over this 10-year period. This next chart basically shows some percentages in terms of, what's happened over this 10-year period is for the general fund, in terms of the total pie, if you took all those sources together, and that provided 100% of your funding, back in 2008, the general fund was 84% of the total funds, but for 2018, it shrunk slightly down to just over 81%. Circuit breaker funding is not quite a double, but it went from 2.4% of the total to 4.2%. Again, grants, federal and state grants went from 4% to 2.2%. Private grants went from 0.2% to 2.5%. Food service operation is fairly consistent. And then all other special revenues and fees, these are our fee-based programs, tuition, busing fees, music lesson fees, student activity fees, all of those things on a percentage basis have grown in importance to our operation in the 10-year span, from being about 5.5% to now 7.1%. And then, on the far right, just another way to look at this is to see in the very far right, the 10-year percentage growth for these categories. And again, the general fund in this 10-year span is 46% growth, circuit breaker funding 162%, but federal and state grants, that's a negative, 15%. Private grants, 1,500% growth. I mean, that's our area of biggest growth over this time period. And then all other special revenues and fees, a 95% growth over this time span. So you can see where the growth and decline areas are by major category. So what I did is I just put together some charts here to show just a little bit more in different types of detail by basic fund. So this is the general fund town appropriation. Again, it is the primary funding source. And it, again, it's decreased from about 84% to 81%. And then what I did on the right here was to take the fiscal 18-year budget, and that's the one that's the most recently completed. We're of course still in fiscal 19, not done. And took the totality of that budget, just over $62.3 million of town appropriation, and then broke it out between how much of it really is funded by state aid, which is 32%, and how much was funded by local contribution. In this case, in this fiscal year, was 68%. So, about a 2/3, 1/3 split, if you will, for our appropriation between state aid and local contributions. So that's the general fund. This is circuit breaker reimbursement. This is a program that provides some reimbursement for high-cost, so-called high-cost special needs students. These are the students that, most of them are in out-of-district placements, but not all. And some of those tuitions are very costly. The average tuition can be in the range of $115,000, $120,000. And some of them can peak out at about $350,000 for a residential placement on an annual basis. So the state devised a program a number of years ago to help school districts with some of those costs, because many times they're unanticipated. When these needs arise, it's not something that fits in neatly into a budget cycle. The needs arise when the needs arise, and those placements need to be made regardless of whether or not you budgeted for them or if they're in your budget plan or not. So the state came into this program and started called the Circuit Breaker Reimbursement Program, which basically says if the individual student cost is more than about $45,000, that they will then reimburse a portion of the dollars above the $45,000. And they do it a year after it occurs, so there's a 1-year lag. So there's lots of reporting that's done on an individual student basis by the special education department, and that's what leads to our reimbursement amounts. And then you can kind of see, just this chart here, I went from fiscal 13, we were at about 2.5 million, and we peaked out in fiscal 17 at 3.47, and now we're on a slow decline here, but the percentages, the bar chart is the percentage reimbursement that the state offers. So the percentages have been hanging pretty solid in the low 70s. The maximum that they will reimburse is 75% by statute. So we've got a decline, but the percentages are even. So what that means basically is we're retaining more students in district. That has been the trend, and we've shown that through some of our enrollment charts, and that's a good thing that we're keeping our students in district. It's more cost-effective, certainly, but also better to educate the child in his home school district. So that really kind of accounts for that drop-off and decline there in circuit breaker. Federal and state grants, again, as Ms. Clouder was mentioning, lots of targeted funding, lots of rules and regulations and restrictions on the use of funds. Federal grants are on the left on this bar chart. Back in 08, there were about 1.9 million. Then in fiscal 13, peaked out just about 2.4 million. And then in 18, a pretty big drop off to 1.7 million. So federal funding has been on the decline, as has state funding. And you can see that just to the right there, the state funding in fiscal 18, we only received $7,600 in state funding, state grant funding. So that's become, federal state grants, while they are important in totality of dollars, you know, on a percentage basis, they've been growing less important, if you will. And so that basically just, in order to provide those programs, it shifts cost back into the local budget, if you want to continue to provide those level of services to those students. Private grants, again, these are the ones that we would be actively seeking out. You know, our teachers do this, again, on an annual basis with either the Shrewsbury Education Foundation or our development folks, Michelle Biscotti, Kathleen Cohane, who did in our fundraising committee with the Bonomos, led by the Bonomos, did a fabulous job raising funding for the turf project. And so you can see, back in '08, you know, we received just about $120,000 in private grants. It climbed, more than doubled in fiscal 13, over $325,000, and then in 2018, just about $1.95 million. That's a combination. That's not just turf. That's also all those other programs combined in that category of private grants. So, an area of enormous growth for the district. Food service operation. Again, this is one of those programs that is completely self-funded. So all of the monies that are paid for student or staff lunches, and then in addition to the reimbursements that we receive from the federal government through the State Department of Education, all of those things fund all of the expenses, all of the payroll, all of the benefits, all of the food costs, repairs and equipment, and now that's just over a $2.1 million project. You can see there was a dip there in 13, and you know, I think anecdotally that's partially due to a drop-off in participation, and you know, also during that time period we had some more, you know, lots of changes with respect to what types of foods could be served in our cafeterias and what types of foods could no longer be served. And I think that we had our consumers making some choices there and adjusting. All other special revenues and fees, again, I put a listing here. This is not the totality. This area, this grouping of funds has, you know, 38 different funds included. The private grants category, right now, we're running 51 different funds. So just those two combined, we're running, what, 89 different funds, if you will, that all require their own special separate accounting for both revenues and expenditures. And in this area, other special revenues and fees, you know, again, busing, athletics, and this has been an area of significant growth over this time span, of course. It's become a critically important source of funding to subsidize these programs, not pay for in totality, but simply to help offset costs. You know, although I will say that for example, the extended school care program, and I know you're going to vote on that this evening, that is a program that is completely self-funded. Again, all of those fees or tuitions that parents pay for before or after school care go for all of the payroll, benefits, supplies, and what have you for those staff. So an area of significant growth and importance there. So just some final notes. You know, the general fund town appropriation, again, it is our primary, most important funding source, but it has decreased actually as a percent over this time span. The district has been proactive and successful in securing private grant funding. We saw that from the chart. Federal and state grant funding has decreased, and circuit breaker actually is now a more important funding source in terms of total dollars than all of the federal and state grants combined. The district's reliance on fee-based revenue has grown to about $5.5 million a year, and that's a necessary funding source. And we're going to talk more about fees in the next or an upcoming report as well, so there'll be more details on that. So, you know, in final, just the final note, kind of where I began, which is that the district operates on a multitude of sources of funding, not just the tax revenue. And happy to respond to any questions. By the way, of course, you have 3 years of data, recently completed 3 years of data, both revenue and expense and fund balances for all the private grants and revolving funds in your packet. That's what I have.
Thank you for the presentation, Mr. Collins. Colleagues, questions and comments? Dr. McGee.
So this is an important report. I think everybody should know that the town appropriated budget is not the entire funding source, and that we're going everywhere we possibly can to get additional funds to support the district. But my sense is that 18, with regard to private fundraising, was a bit of a bubble. And I wonder whether you've got a year-to-date number for FY19 at all regarding our fundraising, or at least the Colonial
I
Fund?
don't have that for you right now, but I can certainly get that for you.
Okay, just, my expectation is there was such a push for turf, and of that nearly 2 million, I'm willing to bet over 90% was turf.
Yeah, and actually, that's, in your report there, we can just kind of pick it out there. So for fiscal 18, of that total 1.95 million, 1.7 of it was for turf.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
So about $250,000 was the other, and that's pretty consistent with the most recent years.
But we're still raising hundreds of thousands of dollars on
Absolutely.
that source.
Colleagues, further questions and comments? Seeing none, Dr. Sawyer, did you have anything you wanted to add before we moved to the next item?
Please, just to, thanks the report, and also just to note that the business office personnel do an outstanding job, in particular Dottie Flynn, managing all these different accounting. We were, there's a lot of very specific pieces, and also in conjunction with the treasurer's office and the town accountant's office, in terms of supporting this work. And it's something that, of course, as we look to implement our strategic plan going forward, hoping that, whether it's for a specific large project such as the athletic field project or other elements that we're trying to push relative to our strategic plan, we know that there are resources out there, and the question is how do we best tap into them, and that's something that we're going to continue to work towards. But I agree, it is important to note that we certainly go far beyond the appropriated budget that's approved at town meeting, whether it's grant funding or whether it is these other kinds of funding, or, as we're going to talk about shortly, the kinds of fees and tuitions that parents are paying for in a variety of ways. So appreciate the insight, and hope this was helpful to the community and those who are watching.
And I believe Mr. Collins is going to remain in place for our next agenda item, which is a report on tuitions and fees for fiscal year 2020. Mr. Collins will present information for fees related to busing, athletics, and student activities, along with tuition rates for preschool and full-day kindergarten for the 2019-2020 school year, including illustrating potential adjustments to these fees and tuitions. Colleagues, it is not our intention to take up a vote on any of these particular items tonight. The superintendent will be making a recommendation to the committee regarding his feelings on action about those fee structures at our next meeting on March 27th, and I anticipate a vote on some of these at that time. So with that, back to Mr. Collins.
Okay, thank you. Again, as you mentioned, I'll just be presenting, some information and then some options for consideration. And we do know that in the interim, you'll be receiving possibly some input from the community, and then Dr. Sawyer's recommendation on the 27th. And we do hope that you will vote on the 27th so that we can make all the communications that necessarily need to be made at this particular time of year so that parents can plan ahead. And just as, for example, that, we would typically roll out the bus registration program on or about April 1st, so the timing is important for this report and your vote. Some of the assumptions that some, and I should probably have recharacterized this a little bit, that smaller price increases will likely have a de minimis impact on participation or ridership. Although I will have to say, because parents experience this every day if they're driving their child to school, that in the morning drop-off and the afternoon pickup, that we are experiencing traffic problems, traffic congestion, traffic backups, very long lines at all of our schools. Whether you're trying to drive up the high school hill in the morning, or you're trying to pick up your child in the afternoon at Pat's school and have to hug over to the curb that doesn't exist on the right-hand side on Municipal Drive. You know, it's really kind of all over the place. So, you know, I do think with respect to the transportation fee that many parents have made the choice to avoid the fee. You know, some are doing carpooling, but there are lots of children who are being driven to school these days instead of riding the bus. And I do think that some of it has to do with the fee level. That said, the fee revenue increases that you might see in terms of options will certainly, you know, help, excuse me, close the existing gap between the superintendent's initial budget recommendation and where the town manager's recommendation has been. And so that is certainly for your consideration. And then I know that, you know, in this particular discussion we've had in years past is, you know, one, again, whether it's, you know, a philosophy or a strategy or a tactic, you know, what is the best way to manage these fees for parents? Is it better to, you know, hold them steady for a couple of years and then have a larger, you know, one-time increase, or have smaller increases on an annual basis? And so that's also something for your consideration as well. And I know that certainly none of us involved in this like having to do, you know, any of this in terms of course, imposing fees or having to collect them or administer them or account for them. But it is, as I mentioned, in the totality of the operation, a critical funding source in about $5.5 million in total. So we're on to it. Bus fees. Right now, you can see the fee history back in fiscal 16. We're at $250. Then we went up to $275 and held steady for 2 years. This current year, we're at $300. That was a 9% increase. Estimating that the total revenue this year would be about $712,000. You know, and then I put to the right of the shaded bar there, of course, and all of these I put at 0%, just as a scenario. It's not going to create any additional revenue, but if the fee went from $300 to $310, for example, that would be a 3.3% increase and would raise just over $23,000 more than the $712. Go to 310, you're going to raise another $47,000 on top of the 712. So what I also did was I highlighted in blue, that is, I think, a blue shade, but that was the assumption that I used when building our town appropriation expense budget. So in this case, in most cases, I assumed a 0% increase so that the committee, if you wish to decide based upon Dr. Sawyer's recommendation to increase some of these things, then again, that will help our overall closure of the gap. Athletic fees, again, back in 16, we were at 290, we went to 300, we're currently at 310, estimating $348,000 total revenue for this year. If you go up by $5, that would be a 1.6% increase and raise just about another $5,500. Of course, don't need to read all of these, but that's just kind of the layout for you. 325, you'd be about another $17,000. Preschool tuitions, there's varying rates depending on the number of days a child attends, but this is the three-day-a-week option here, just for the historical piece. We're at right now just over $2,700 per year. Estimated revenue this year is $575,000 for all preschool programs combined. And you know, if you did a 3% increase, for example, that would raise another $17,000. Excuse me. So that is preschool. full-day kindergarten, based upon the district and school committee 5-year plan to step down full-day kindergarten over these coming years with the advent of opening up Beal as a full-day kindergarten opportunity for all children, tuition-free, that we've been, have this plan in place to step down the tuition, annual tuition over the years leading up to the opening of Beal, so that it's not just one lump sum in any one particular year. And I also included a lot of information from the Strategies for Effective Children, a nonprofit organization. There's one piece that I wanted to reference, which I found very interesting because, and I know we provide these each year, but I looked at last year, there were 56 communities that had been charging a full-day kindergarten tuition fee in the year 17-18. And in this school year, 18-19, it went from 56 down to 45. So 11 communities just this year, for, you know, 20% of them, about completely eliminated their fee. And I think I listed some of those in your report that I provided. So for example, Abington, Ashland, Longmeadow, Linfield, Marshfield, Medway, Norton, Pembroke, Plymouth, Seekonk, and Winchester, all this year eliminated their full-day kindergarten. So they're now tuition-free in universal kindergarten. What I provided for you is, again, some options, some rate history. It was $3,700 in fiscal 16. It went up to $4,000 per year. This year, it was a 10% drop down to $3,600. And then I provided the option for you. And again, the blue shaded area was my assumption for the budget based upon the strategic priorities that we would be, over the next 3 years, taking it down to zero. And so if that were to be voted for approval, the rate would go from $3,600 per year down to $2,400 per year. And we would see a decrease in that overall revenue, about $144,000. But that was the assumption built into this budget. So that is what I have for you on the fee information, and happy to respond to any questions that you might have.
Mrs. Gonzano.
Thank you. And I was curious, when you talked about the bus fee, and you showed us the 4-year history of where it came to 75 to now 300. Would you be able to speak to the kind of traffic challenges that have occurred between 2016 and today? I don't know if that's something that might be anecdotal, but has there been an increase in traffic in these past 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I couldn't give you, specific car counts at
Right.
schools or things like that. I think it is anecdotally for sure that, we certainly have problems at all of our schools at different times of day. I mentioned a few of the schools. I didn't mention Oak. That's just another example of in the morning. Oak Street being backed up with drop-offs as parents enter Oak Middle School down by the tennis courts. Take a left in, they drop off their child. They're coming back out onto Oak Street.
Yeah.
And they're wanting, many of them, to take a left-hand turn to access Route 9.
Right.
But because of all the oncoming traffic, heading south on Oak,
Correct.
they're getting caught up.
Yes.
And then the traffic can't flow out, and so it's
Right.
getting stuck, and it's like this, traffic jam,
Yeah.
classic traffic jam.
Yeah.
So that's just another, example of the problems, and, they are growing, for sure. So, sorry, it's anecdotal, but this is something that is well observed by well experienced and well observed by parents and school administrators on a daily basis.
And just to follow, is it because people are coming early so like they can, that used to be you wanted to be the first in line to do the drop off, but then it creates this long, then they're sitting there for a half an hour and it's
Yeah, that, in the afternoons, we certainly, I've heard that, again, Patton School is another good example with parents
Right.
trying to be first in line, parking on the side of Municipal Drive. Same thing on the access road to Sherwood Middle School off of Crescent Street. And parking on that access road, and it's causing traffic problems for us as well, so. It definitely is a problem across the district.
So bottom line is, we would like for students to take the bus.
That'd be great.
That's alleviate the traffic.
Dr. McGee?
So, a couple of things. One, if I'm doing my math right, this is roughly 80 cents a ride for the bus at the current rate, if we're doing 180 days. So from a financial point of view, I could see where parents may want to have drive their children to or from because of convenience. But to sit with a car that's idling for a while, to drive a few miles in each direction, a whole bunch of things make it not a wonderful financial decision, even at the current rates. I have a question about fees in general, though, in that it would be helpful to me to understand, for example, we're charging currently a fee of $300 for the bus. What's it cost us for that? For athletic fees in general, what is the athletic department cost versus how much we collect in fees? And, so I just would like to get a sense as to where we are with those fees.
Sure. I mean, I could follow up with more specific information. I could tell you that, for the athletic program, it's funding approximately 50% of the total operation.
Okay.
For the busing program, it's going to be less. It's going to be in the neighborhood of probably 30 to 40% of that operation.
Okay.
But, I could follow up with more detailed
Close
information.
enough. I mean, the point is that these are still heavily subsidized, even with the fees.
Yes, we still have significant dollars
Right.
in our operating budget, and these are just providing an offset, a portion of the funding of the total cost, absolutely.
Thank you.
Mrs. Fritz?
I think, over the years, we've seen creep in the fees. Out of necessity, we've had to do that in order to not reduce or maybe eliminate. If we become much more dependent on that funding. We can't go back, we keep seeing this creep. And I personally worry about cost saturation for families. They get to a tipping point where they have to decide, am I gonna pay the fees? It's just the high school. I mean, I think it's when you have your biggest fee burden for families. You provided that Mass Public School survey of fees. And when you look through that document, we have some of the highest, if not the highest fees in the state for a lot of ours. So I think we have to be really cognizant of the fact that our families are supplementing public education with fees in order so that we don't reduce, but we're so heavily dependent on those over time. You mentioned our decision last year to reduce the amount for full-day kindergarten. I do continue to think that's a prudent decision, because when we get to the end and we open that new building, we're not going to have a $500,000 gap that we have to fill. So I do think, that's the course to stay, but I am very concerned for parents to continue to be looking at fees. We're not voting tonight, but I personally like the smaller increments versus one large. I think it's easier for families to manage.
Colleagues, further questions and comments? I'll echo both of Mrs. Fritz's remarks in general. Obviously, while I understand the necessity of fees, I remain concerned at how heavily we fee as a district in order to provide the education that we provide. Obviously, it's a necessity. It's a necessity that's been there for 10, 15 years now and growing. It's something that none of us like, and so to whatever extent we can manage to hold them down, I think would be a prudent course of action, obviously, in the context of the fiscal realities that we have to live with in the district. I also believe that continuing along the path towards reducing reliance on the kindergarten fee is prudent in order to keep with the school committee's own goal of full-day kindergarten that is tuition-free for all students by 2022, or when we're able to open the new Beale School. Just to highlight something in your report, Mr. Collins, for folks at home, and to apply a little bit of context here, we are one of the last districts that is feeing for full-day K. We saw the number of public school districts charging tuition in Massachusetts for kindergarten decrease from 56 to 45 in just last year, a 20% decrease in a single year. It looks like about 10 municipalities did that, so by the time we actually achieve this goal a few years from now, we are going to be one of the last trains out of the station. So I do think it's important for us to continue on that path. I think that a free full-day kindergarten program is in keeping with what Massachusetts families deserve and frankly expect. So that's something I feel very strongly about. Dr. Sawyer, anything you wanted to add at this time?
I concur. I think the questions and the comments were helpful to me in terms of I consider what to recommend to the committee. To echo Mr. Collins, and none of us, and some of us, like Mr. Collins and I, pay these fees as parents, and so we have firsthand experience with what the impact is, and in a perfect world, we would prefer not to assess them or ask the school committee to do so, but it is a reality of our budget. It has been for many years at this point, and I think the idea is how can we be fair in terms of maintaining some proportionality between other costs that are escalating due to normal inflation, but also not reaching a saturation point, as Ms. Fritz mentioned. So for your next meeting, I will certainly provide with your meeting packet what my recommendations are, and would look forward to, obviously, any one in the public who we will post this information, who has feedback for the committee or for myself in terms of what their preference would be or perspective, are welcome to give that feedback between now and the time we would ask you to vote at our meeting in 2 weeks on March 27th.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Thank you, Mr. Collins.
Thank you.
Moving on with our agenda, the next item is under old business. It is a vote with regard to extended school care tuition and financial aid. By way of background, at our last regular school committee meeting on February 27th, Ms. Karen Isaacson, who is our Director of Extended Learning, presented a report on the fiscal status of the program. Ms. Isaacson recommended a 3.5% tuition increase and using lunch subsidy eligibility as a proxy for financial need, with student eligibility for reduced price lunch providing a 60% discount and eligibility for free lunch providing an 80% discount for the coming FY20. We did receive quite a bit of feedback. I am in receipt as chairperson of 5 emails on the topic, all of which either directly or indirectly endorsed the proposed fee increase. There were a lot of compliments to the program, which is certainly nice to see. We did receive some feedback regarding a family having hardship with regard to the change in how financial need is calculated. I will come back to that in a minute. First, I just want to see if Dr. Sawyer or Mr. Collins have anything they wanted to add.
No, I recommend what Ms. Eisen recommended for the increase and for the change in financial aid approach.
Okay. Colleagues, I'm actually going to start off the discussion. According to Ms. Isaacson, the number of families that's going to be impacted adversarially by the change in the way that the financial need is calculated is actually quite small. And in light of that, it is of interest to me to try to help ease those families into the transition. I intend as an individual, it's not a recommended motion in our book, I intend as an individual member to offer a motion tonight to allow grandfathering for just 1 year for those families to, in the coming year, pay a reduced fee under the old model. It would not be in perpetuity, it would only be in the coming year. That's a motion I'm making as an individual member based on that feedback we received. Actually, and as we proceed to a vote, it would be 2, if not 3 separate votes. We would take a vote on the extended school care tuition increase. Separately, we would take a vote with regard to changing the financial aid model, and separately, I would offer a motion with regard to the grandfathering for the single year. So I just wanted to offer those remarks before I open it up to the committee for discussion on any of those topics.
I support all 3.
Same here.
Okay, questions, comments? Okay, so I would entertain a motion that the committee vote to approve the recommended 3.5% increase to the extended school care tuition effective in fiscal year 2020.
So moved.
Motion has been made. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion is made and seconded. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? The motion carries unanimously. I would entertain a motion that the committee vote to approve the recommended change to the extended school care financial aid model for FY20 So that aid is provided by discounting the tuition rate by 60% for students who are eligible for reduced price lunch and by 80% for students who are eligible for free lunch. Do I have such a motion? So moved.
Second.
Motion has been made and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. I'm going to make, not entertain, but I am making myself a motion that the committee vote to allow families who are currently receiving financial aid for extended school care and who do not qualify for free and reduced lunch to be provided financial aid for the 2019-2020 school year at the lesser of either their current level of discount or a 60% discount. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Next on our agenda is a memorandum of understanding with the Shrewsbury Federal Credit Union, the Colonial Connections Program. I am actually going to, barring any objections from members, hold this until our next meeting. We colleagues are going to be soon receiving a report from the UMass Collins Center for Public Management that was done at our central office at administrative capacity. That is a resource that will be helpful to committee members as we consider this proposal. So barring any objections, we are going to hold this item until March 27th. The next item on our agenda is the approval of minutes. And enclosed are the minutes of our regular meeting of February 27th, 2019. They were prepared by Ms. McCollum, our clerk, and reviewed by Mrs. Fritz as secretary. Colleagues, are there any questions, corrections, deletions, changes of any kind? Seeing none, without objection, those minutes are accepted. We do need to go into executive session this evening. I would entertain a motion that the school committee enter into executive session for the purpose of collective bargaining with cafeteria workers and for the purpose of collective bargaining with the Shrewsbury Education Association, where deliberation in an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the bargaining position of the public body, and for the purpose of reviewing, approving, and/or releasing executive session minutes, and a return to open session only for the purpose of adjourning for the evening. Do I have such a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Motion has been made and seconded. This motion requiring a roll call vote to pass. Dr. McGee.
Aye.
Mr. Wensky.
Aye.
Mrs. Fritz. Mrs. Canzano.
Aye.
Mr. Palich. Aye. Thank you.